The first theme that your textbook goes through in Chapter 1 is the theme of organization. So biologists can study a lot of different questions. Some questions can encompass large spaces of land. Other questions might be just looking at the interactions of individual molecules. So clearly, there's a lot of study in biology, and one biologist cannot do everything. And so what we can do is we can sort of take the Earth, which is this entity that holds all of life on our planet, and we can start to chunk it up into smaller and smaller sections, and scientists may choose sometimes just to study one of these sections at a time. So this slide will take you through the different levels of biological organization on our planet, starting with the entire biosphere, right? So that's our Earth. What we can do is we can take the Earth then and divide it up into what are called ecosystems. I'm sure you've learned about these previously in school. Right, ecosystems are essentially a large area of the biosphere where life and non-living things can interact. So examples of ecosystems would be a forest or a tundra or a desert or bodies of water, for example. Now that's still a very large area to study, and so what we can do with an ecosystem is we can take all of the non-living components within that area out and just focus on the living components. This is what we would call communities. So in the example on this slide, you can see a forest. That's the ecosystem. If we were to look at that ecosystem, that include all the living things plus the water and the air and the soil, those non-living components in that area as well. But if we take the non-living out, what we're left with are communities. And in that picture, you can see you've got some trees, you've got some shrubs, you have some deer. All of those belong to that same community, which is essentially just all the living things in that given area. Now that still is fairly complex, although ecologists, for example, might study communities. Some individuals might want to just study one population within a community. And so in this, again, example of the forest, all of the maple trees of a particular species would be considered a population. So population will be a group of living organisms, all of the same species. If you were to think of us all sitting in the lecture class, we would be a population of humans in that lecture class, for example. Now, populations are still made out of individual living things, and so that's the definition of an organism. An organism is an individual living thing. Individual living things can be as large as a tree, as large as an elephant, or they can be as small as an individual bacterial cell. So you have a lot of variability there as well. But still, an organism is a single living thing. Your more complex organisms are going to be made out of organs and organ systems. You can take that living thing and break it down into smaller components. Organ systems are easy to talk about or identify in humans, maybe a little more complex or maybe abstract when you're thinking of plants, right? So in, again, this slide, you see an example where an organism is an individual maple tree. You wouldn't think of a tree as having organs, but in fact it does. A leaf, for example, would be considered an organ. An organ is going to be an organization of different tissues that all come together to play a specific role. So the leaf, for example, its main role is to gather sunlight to help the plant itself produce sugar or food for the plant. Now, organs and organ systems are still fairly complex. You can take an organ and you can break it down into individual tissues. The way we would define a tissue would be individual cells, many of them the same type, coming together to form sort of a larger mass that has a particular function. So number 7 here, where it says tissues, you actually see a cross section of this maple leaf from this maple tree. And this is just one picture, but you're looking at the intersection between two types of tissues for the leaf. On the left hand side, you can see kind of spongy tissue. This is called the mesophyll tissue. This is the tissue that's responsible for the process of photosynthesis, and we'll take a closer look at that later on this semester. But so those are all mesophyll cells, and their main responsibility is to do photosynthesis. On the right-hand side, though, here you see a different kind of tissue. This is the epidermis. Much like you have an epidermis or skin, the leaf also has skin, and it essentially performs very similar functions to what your skin does for you in terms of protection. And so it protects the internal mesophyll tissue of the leaf. Now, tissues, again, being made out of identical cells that perform the same function to attain some sort of function for that larger aggregate of cells, are still made out of smaller components, hence cells. And so we take a look at cells next. And here you see in the image one of those mesophyll cells that is part of the mesophyll tissue. Now, cells are particularly important because this is the lowest level or the smallest level of biological organization that can still embody all of those properties of life that we discussed. So they can reproduce, they can adapt, they can regulate, they perform energy processing, they grow and develop. You name it, they do it. While cells are the smallest level of this organization that can still embody life, you can still break them down into smaller components. It's just that those smaller components on their own are not going to be considered alive. So one of the smaller components that cells, some of them are made out of, are something called organelles. So much like an organism has organs, right? These specialized compartments that have special jobs. Same thing goes for a cell. A cell has organelles, again, specialized compartments that perform a specific function for the cell itself. So in this image, you see an example of an organelle that's called the chloroplast. And the chloroplast's responsibility is to perform photosynthesis in one of these mesophyll cells. And you can see in the figure here, all of those green little circles on the inside of the cell, each one of those is an individual chloroplast. And then down here you can see an electron microscope image of one of those chloroplasts. Chloroplasts, again, because they're organelles and they're smaller than a cell, they don't embody all the properties of life, so we wouldn't consider them as being alive. But we can still further break down organelles into individual molecules, and here's an example of a molecule that you might find in one of those organelles. So while we've taken now in this theme of organization the entire biosphere and we've divided it up into smaller and smaller components, for the rest of the semester we're going to go opposite. So we're going to start small and we're going to start to build. So our first few chapters will introduce us to molecules. We're going to understand what kinds of molecules are used to build organelles, and then we're going to look into how organelles come together to form cells. And that's pretty much where we're going to sort of leave off when it comes to Biology 1406, and then you'll get into tissues and organ systems in Biology 1407 and anatomy and physiology if you go on to take those courses. But something to consider. So as we now start from the small, start adding small components together to get something bigger, we have a sort of unique theme that pops up. And this is the theme of emergent properties. So when you take smaller parts of a system and put them together to build the system now shows these unique properties that the original individual parts didn't show. And this is something that applies to biological systems as well as non-biological systems. I think in your book uses the example of a box of bicycle parts, right? Let's say you're staring at a box of bicycle parts. How far is that going to get you? Not going to get you anywhere, right? But if you take those individual bicycle parts and you start putting together, you have these new properties emerge, right? If you find some pedals, attach them to the gears, attach them to chains, now you'll notice, hey, when I move the pedals, that's going to spin the gears and that'll move the chain. If you attach the chain to bicycle tires, now if you pedal, you can move the tires themselves. You still don't have a place to sit. You can't steer, but you're getting somewhere, right? These new properties are emerging the more parts you stick together, and these properties are very different from the individual parts that you used. And again, this is something that you can apply now to living systems as well, right? You take molecules, use them to build organelles. Each organelle has a specific function that will help a cell survive, and you put more organelles together, and now you have a cell that can actually embody all those properties of life. All right, so let's talk about cells for a minute. We've already established that cells are this lowest or smallest level of biological organization that can still perform all of those properties of life that we talked about. And cells are interesting in that every single cell is enclosed by something that's called a membrane. All right, so this is the boundary of the cell. Not only does it delineate what's outside versus inside the cell, but it's also a structure that regulates the passage of materials between the cell and its environment. So the cell, being alive, needs to get nutrients to come in, and it also needs to get rid of waste. And all this is going to happen across that membrane of the cell. Now, not all cells are the same. There are two basic types of cells. We have eukaryotic cells and we have prokaryotic cells. So let's talk about the differences. Let's do prokaryotic cells first. So prokaryotic cells, you'll notice there are two images here of cells. The prokaryotic cell is the smaller one, looks like a little capsule. Prokaryotic cells, we think, evolved first. We believe this because they are small, they are very simple, and one of the defining features of a prokaryotic cell is it doesn't have any internal subcompartments. It doesn't contain any of these organelles or what we call membrane-bound compartments on the inside of the cell. So indeed, they are very simple. On the other hand, the eukaryotic cell, which is this other cell here, is generally much larger than a prokaryotic cell. We think that these evolved later. They also, as a defining feature, have organelles. They have these membrane-bound subcompartments on the inside of the cell, and each one plays a different role for the cell. So, for example, right here in the middle, this is actually an electron micrograph of an actual eukaryotic and prokaryotic cell. The only thing that they've done to this image, usually electron micrographs are black and white, they've added pseudocolors so you can sort of tell apart the different parts of the cell. So in the center here, you've got the blue nucleus that holds the DNA. I mean, that's sometimes thought of as the brain of the cell because it contains all the information on how that cell is to behave and to function. And then you've got all these other brown and sort of light blue and orange circles. Those are other organelles that might perform digestive roles or storage roles for the cell. Much like in our bodies, we have different organs, right? Your stomach performs digestion, your heart pumps your blood, your lungs participate in gas exchange. That's very similar to the inside of a eukaryotic cell, having all these organelles. Now you have these specialized compartments. Each one is responsible for a certain function within the cell.